I want to thank everybody for coming. I'm very impressed on a Saturday night, just about dinner time, and you're all here. So thank you. So my mission today is to kind of introduce the basic ways that I think about what contemporary curating is. So I'll be talking a little bit about some of the people, the key people who have changed the way that we think about curating. I'll be talking about some of the institutions that have kind of paved the way for transforming the way that curating can actually embed itself in museums and galleries. And I'll also be talking about some of the other conditions that have happened through the 60s up to now that have kind of made curating contemporary. But first I want to, I've got to do this one. First I just want to kind of give you the basics. I've for a long time tried to work out what the lowest common denominator would be if you were to describe what curating is. What's the minimum it can be, and if it's not this, if it's not these things, then it couldn't be curating. So I decided that the best way to describe it is that you have to have an audience, you have to have space, you need a curator, or you need somebody who is the kind of bridge between these things, and art, artist, object, something that is kind of happening between the audience and in the space. So in very basic terms, curating is the relationship between these things. And this diagram is very bad, but it's supposed to be a pyramid. So if you imagine a pyramid, it's like there's nothing actually in the center, they're all in relation to each other. And the quote that I put up there is from a curator called Maria Lind, who's based in Sweden. And it's something that I like very much, just as a kind of reminder as to what curating could or should or can be when it's very vital. So she says, curating is a way of thinking in terms of interconnections, linking objects, images, processes, people, locations, histories and discourses in physical space like an active catalyst, generating twists, turns and tensions. So to go back a few hundred years, the word curating it's interesting because the translation, of course, into Russian doesn't work in the same way. But the root of the word curating in Latin is to care for or to care. And so if you kind of go back to the roots of the word curating, it was first used in the 1300s, and it was used to describe people who looked after lunatics or like minors. So, and some people say that curators are still looking after lunatics when they talk about artists. The first time it was used in relation to museums was in 1661, and it was somebody who presides over collections, and it could be a library or a zoo or a museum. And so if you look at the root of this, the term curating, it's about presiding over something. It's like care as like taking care of something that you're like looking over. And I think it's important to look at that way of thinking in comparison to the pyramid that I just showed you, where curating is kind of in among everything else. So in a way you could say that contemporary curating has taken the curator from the kind of overseer into one of a number of people that is integral to the way that we understand art and culture. So this is the speediest march through history that you've ever seen. What I just want to try and get across is, of course, there's more than one notion of care. And so in the very beginning, when the word curating was used in relation to museums, it was very much tied into a kind of civic responsibility, because museums were controlled by the state. It doesn't matter whether you look in across Europe or in Russia, it's the state that kind of opens up these institutions. And the idea is that the curator is taking care of the culture for the masses, so that people can actually come and become educated by understanding the collections that the country has been developing. So it's a kind of civic care. There's then a different way of looking at it, and I'm using a couple of examples here. One is the trains in the around the Russian Revolution, that actually the government commissioned artists to make work in the trains that were going out into the regions. Or I'm also showing you the exhibition Entartete Kunst that was on in Germany. And what I want to point to is the idea of taking care of as propaganda. The idea of using art and culture to send a message. And it's a message that is in relation to politics, and it's in relation to what it is that you want to take care of the way that people understand what it is that you're wanting to communicate. And then the third version is the kind of taking care of oneself. And this is the kind of care as a curator that started to develop at the beginning, with Alfred Barr, basically, and the idea of the Museum of Modern Art in 1929. That's one example. Basically, the idea is that in order to be able to go deeper into culture, you need to take care of your own education. And the training for curators as art historians was about giving yourself the opportunity to understand culture better. And by understanding that and becoming a specialist, then you could share the information to other people. So it's taking care of one's own understanding and then sharing it from there. So that's just kind of 3 different perspectives and roughly the kind of time that they start coming into play. Of course, all of these ways of care in relation to curating have continued to this day. Some have been given more emphasis than others in different places, and you could even say that some curators are more interested in one kind than another. I've got too many buttons here. So just to give you a couple of examples of the way that curating kind of developed within the institution. The first I want to bring up is the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which was developed it opened in 1929, and Alfred Barr, as I say, was the first director, aged 27, which is ridiculous. Now, pretty much everybody is like too old to be able to become a director. The interesting thing is that Alfred Barr came to Moscow, or came to Russia in 1927, 26th of December, 1927. And he spent 2 months here. And some of you may know he has a diary that he kept during his time in Moscow. And there's a number of people now that believe that the way that the program is developed at the Museum of Modern Art in the early days and the thinking behind the structure of it actually comes from here. And it's because of the fact that he started to learn about the Museum of Painterly Culture and the notion of a museum for living artists that was being developed here at the time. So this is, I think, a kind of interesting twist to the way that the Museum of Modern Art developed, and we'll be talking more about that in the museum's conference. Just a few points. What's interesting and important to look at is that with Alfred Barr, the development of the idea of art movement started. He was the first person to teach a course on modern art, and he then started to try and map how different movements come together to create the influences towards contemporary art. And he starts to play this out in 1936 with the first exhibition that he does of 5 that are all about art movements that he does over the next couple of years into the early 40s. And the first one is Cubism and abstract art. And what's interesting that he devises this kind of art movement map, but he also shows art in relation to theatre, design, architecture. So he's looking at Cubism and abstract art across all the arts, but he completely separates it from anything to do with the kind of messiness of real life. And this is something that the Museum of Modern Art became known for, the kind of separation of art from life, which over the years artists have kind of battled to kind of claim back, if you like. Just a side note, the Museum of Modern Art also, I think, is interesting because of the fact that it decided that from the very beginning it was going to be international as well as working in New York. And so it started a program of traveling exhibitions in 1952. And there are suspicious circumstances within which these traveled. It's a very interesting example of basically how the idea of traveling exhibitions and like placing them in other people's countries is very much tied into this idea of propaganda and the idea of kind of selling culture as the best side of your country and trying to improve diplomatic relationships as a consequence. So one very interesting example is the Family of Man exhibition, which started in 1955. And it actually traveled until 1962, so for 7 years, and it had 91 stops around the world, which is quite incredible. There were 9 different versions of it, and it's basically an exhibition that was done by the MoMA, the photography curator, Edward Steichen. And it was just after the Second World War. He'd been actually in the Second World War himself. And he basically decided that he wanted to make an exhibition that could show how the world needed to basically think about peace. And we were all one family, and we were all together. And so he did this open call for photographs kind of describing the family of man from people all over the world. And he had over 10,000 images sent to him. So it took 3 years to sort through these. And in the end, he ended up with 503 images from 273 photographers from 68 countries in total. So as a concept, it was very, very interesting. But basically what happened was this exhibition, as it traveled, put across a very kind of lopsided view of the way that the world was at this time. And it actually came to Moscow in 1959, and it was part of the Great American Exhibition that happened here at the time, which was in Sokolniki Park. Do you know what this? Okay. See, my Russian is perfect. So it was part of this kind of bigger exhibition, and this is when the famous kitchen debate started between Richard Nixon and Khrushchev. And basically it was an argument over the merits of capitalism and communism and which one was better in a display kitchen showing American appliances. And it was televised. So the Family of Man exhibition, you can see some of the images of how popular it was part of that whole thing. So again, very, very tied into the way that governments are trying to kind of portray the way that that culture is kind of integral to the way that the country thinks. Just to show you another example, Alexander Dorner is another very important person in the kind of history of changing the way we think about museums and the way that curating becomes integral to thinking about how museums can change. He is quite different to Alfred Barr because of the fact that he basically wants to integrate modern art and contemporary art into the whole history of art and into the history of everything. So he doesn't want to separate culture out from life, and he doesn't want to separate out the now from the past. But what he does do is rethink what a museum can actually be. And so he is the first person to do what he describes as atmosphere rooms. And it was actually El Lissitzky that produced the atmosphere room for abstract art, and that's the image that you can see here. Some of you may actually know it. It's quite a famous room that was destroyed in 1933. But there have been a number of versions remade of it. This is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, Dorner is somebody who turns to artists and looks to artists for inspiration rather than turning artists into movements and categorizing them, which is what I was describing Barr doing. It's also important because of the fact that he is the first person to start talking about the museum as a laboratory, and the idea of experimentation being something that can happen like through the institution, rather than the institution being the place where everything is fixed and decided and doesn't move. And by thinking through this, it then means that history can actually be flexible as well, and you can go back and start to shift the way that you understand history. That's what's great about this room, because actually some of these panels actually move, and the relationship between images can move. So it's basically kind of starting to try and express the fact that our institutions don't have to fix everything and remain absolute. Jumping forward a very long way, I wanted to turn to Harold Zeman because he is the first person to claim independence from the institution. And whilst we could chart exhibitions and artists and ways of thinking about curating inside institutions, it's also very important to recognize the fact that sometimes there aren't the institutions available, sometimes they don't see, they're not kind of current with the zeitgeist of the ways that people are thinking. And so there was a kind of shift into thinking that curating could become untethered from the institution and could exist in and of itself. So this is a very significant moment, and it's Harold Zeman who did this. And he basically did it because he got very annoyed. And he got annoyed because he was the director of the Kunsthalle Bern in Switzerland, and he did this exhibition called When Attitudes Become Form, which I'll talk about in a minute. But basically the trustees of the Kunsthalle did not like this one bit. It was very messy. And it was basically the end of a kind of long run-in Harold Zeman had with the bureaucracy and with the people who took care of the institution long term, because of the fact that they didn't like the way that he was presenting contemporary art. And so he basically resigned from the institution after this exhibition, and he set up the Agency for Intellectual Guest Labour. And so he basically made a claim, and he said that as a curator, he is going to create his own institution, and his institution is him and an agency of people that work with him. So for the rest of his life, even though he worked within a number of different museums and in biennials, he always had his own team, and he always had his own office that grew and grew and grew with an archive. And so basically, he started thinking about curating not as a case of making one exhibition and then making another and then another, but as an ongoing process, and as something that was like a way of thinking. He also actually didn't use the word curator at all because he felt that the word curator was too attached to institutions. So he called himself an exhibition maker and was very specific about what that meant. And I'll read to you the description. He says an exhibition maker is an administrator, an amateur, an author of introductions, a librarian, a manager and accountant, an animator, a conservator, a financier, and a diplomat. So you can see he was very aware of the fact that once you remove the curatorial role from the institution where it has a support structure, you then basically have to take on the support structure yourself. And so you have to become, in effect, a jack of all trades, but you also have to roll up your sleeves and get messy with the rest of them. And this is carried through to today. I think that's a very important trait of the ways that curators think and work today. So when attitudes become form, just quickly, it was an exhibition that he did in 1969, and it's now seen as very important because of the fact that, one, it was one of the earliest attempts of trying to bring artists together from Europe and the United States. And it was a very early exhibition to think of the exhibition space as a studio. So instead of just bringing works, basically Harold invited as many of the artists as possible to come to Bern and to install their own work. So there was this crazy mess of a process going on running up to the opening, whereby many of the artists were actually there and making the works in situ. And that's why the title is what it is. So it basically kind of shifted the, finally, completely, it shifted the exhibition from being something that was static to something that was kind of in process. There's a number of films and there's a number of stories as to what went on, and the fact that some people faked making the work and they actually brought it in advance, and all sorts of scandals. But it's an exhibition that has had a lot of resonance because of the fact that it's completely shifted the way that we think about how to make an exhibition and the participation of the artist in that process. Another exhibition that was central to his practice and to the way that we think about exhibition making today, and especially biennials today, is Documenta 5, which he produced in 1972. And he was kind of the director general of this exhibition. So he worked with a team of curators and thinkers and administrators, and together they made the whole biennial. Documenta 5 was important because it was the first time that a claim was made that the exhibition was not, it wasn't a 90-day exhibition, it was a 90-day event, i.e. something different would happen on a regular basis, and the exhibition would be constantly changing, it would be performative, it would be flexible. So again, this is kind of shifting how we think about what can actually happen and be called an exhibition. Also, what Zeman did for this was make sure that there were a number of different exhibitions within the big exhibition, and they were around subjects that had nothing to do with art often. So they were around mythology, around science fiction, around advertising, and then he also invited artists to design their own museums. And so there are a number of artists, there's one example here, the Klaus Oldenburg Mouse Museum. There are a number of presentations of artist museums themselves. I just wanted to draw your attention to this text. This is just to show that Harold Zeman, although he's now celebrated as the best curator ever, there were a whole load of questions, and artists were kind of doubtful about the way that he was working sometimes. This is a letter from Robert Morris that went into Flash Art magazine, which is also an indication of showing you how artists became aware of how publicity and marketing could actually really affect the way that the public could find out what you were doing. And it's basically saying that we don't want, there's a number of artists that signed this letter, but it's basically saying we do not want to take part in exhibitions that you have decided the theme of, decided what the outcome is going to be, and decided how our work is going to be read and perceived. We don't want you to borrow work from private collections and just put it up without our permission, and we do not want you to basically speak for us. So there was a whole dialogue and conversation that kind of went rampant around the 1970s with the rise of the curator becoming almost like an artist themselves. And I think this has continued to this day. The next stop along the march of time I want to make is 1989, because it's the next kind of key moment. And it's the moment that will go down in history as the beginning of globalization. We can argue that it happened before and afterwards, but it's that kind of moment when everybody says we are now global. Things have fallen down, things have risen up. There's all sorts of kind of different ways in which we can connect to each other. And in 1991, of course, there was the kind of worldwide spread of the internet, which started in '89, but it was 1991 that email started here and in many, many other places. So Art in America did its first global issue, and it was, interestingly, the first magazine to actually do a global issue. You'd have thought that a more international magazine would have done it, because Art in America is isn't known for being international, put it that way. The curator that you see on the screen is Hu Han Ru, and he's an example of a new generation of curators that started to practice. He is somebody that was born and brought up in Beijing, and he was part of the Tiananmen Square uprisings. And at that time, he then left and went to Paris and basically stayed in Paris and started curating from there rather than in Beijing. And that's when he came into contact with a number of other curators and started to become kind of enmeshed in the international art scene. And this is a story that could be told of many curators of that time. And one of the reasons was this exhibition, Magicians de la Terre, which happened in 1989. It was curated by Jean-Hubert Martin. Some of you may know him because he curated the Moscow Biennial that was on in Garage in, I can't remember the date, 2006? No, be later than that. Anyway, this exhibition was 3 years in the making, and Jean-Hubert Martin, from the very beginning, claimed that this was going to be the first ever global exhibition. And by that he meant truly international, not thinking about this kind of US, United States, European axis. He wanted to look beyond this and like as far away from this kind of center as possible. So he basically selected 50 artists from Europe and the United States, that was looking as far away as possible, and 50 artists from the rest of the world. There was one Russian, Ilya Kabakov, and Jean-Hubert Martin actually curated Kabakov's first exhibition as well, which was in 1985, internationally. So what he also wanted to do was remove it from any politics. He didn't want it to be involved in all this kind of the mechanisms of politics that were rampant at the time. So he basically, that's why it's called Magician de la Terre, or Magicians of the Earth, because he basically wanted to look to the spiritual side of art, and he wanted to look to the ways that artists were basically kind of shifting the way that we could understand a kind of global perspective, which is all well and good, apart from the fact that basically what happened was there was this kind of mess of mixing metaphors, if you like, and kind of introducing artists who didn't even call themselves artists, from places like Aboriginal artists from Australia, or people who were basically kind of practicing under very, very different kind of guises of practice. And so it became a very kind of confusing exhibition. And it's one that is both celebrated and regarded as a complete disaster to this day. I am looking for, there's one artist called Alfredo Yar, who is in the exhibition. I don't have an image of his work, but he, in Art in America, actually, the global issue, he wrote about his experience of what it was like to walk into this exhibition. And he's talking about kind of walking into where that big, the Richard Long circle is. He's talking about walking into that exhibition hall. So he says, one morning there was Esther Mangaloo from South Africa painting her house. In front of her, Cyprian Tugudagba from Benin was finishing a sculpture. Next to both of them, a group of Australian Aboriginal artists were working in their sand painting. And 5 meters further back, Richard Long was making one of his large mud drawings. What a sight. They were so close together and so far apart at the same time. And I think that it's important to recognize exactly that kind of proximity. It's like during the early 90s particularly, the whole question as to how you could actually make something international, what it meant, was really, really central to an awful lot of people's concerns, because you can't just kind of bring things together and say, here, we are the world. It's kind of almost as bad as the family of man example. And yet it's persevered because of the fact that it also kind of brought a lot of questions to the fore that we've been trying to answer ever since. Another person that was important at the time, another place, was Cuba and the Havana Biennial. Actually, the Havana Biennial was started in 1984, but because, of course, it wasn't happening in Paris or somewhere central, everybody overlooked it, which is why Magician de la Terre could be the first global exhibition. It is fair to say that it was in 1989, the third Havana Biennial, that the show really went international. And it's always been a biennial that focuses on the connections between basically Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. So it's kind of intentionally focusing away from the so-called center. And Gerardo Mosquera was a curator and a researcher for the first 3 biennials. And I mean, you can read the quote for yourself, but what I think is important and interesting is that he brings up the fact that there are a number of different peripheries at this time and a number of different centers. And it is fake to think that globalization actually connects them. It's not true, as we know. And he also brings up the fear of the idea of these curators kind of traveling and visiting artists and making these international shows, and basically supposing that they can actually make transcultural judgments, that they can understand the meaning of a work and put it next door to another one to create a message for the exhibition. And I think it's still something that we're struggling with now. How far do we go with this? I know it's something we're definitely talking about at Garage. So biennials, 1990s, it's like if you think of the decade of the 1990s, you really have to kind of think of it as the biennial boom. So there were 27 biennials that were made between 1895 and 1988. And then in 1989 to the end of the 90s, there were 32 more. Can you believe it? So, they sprung up in many, many, many places. And they basically became a way in which places that didn't necessarily have institutions or permanent structures could participate in this international dialogue through art. They also became a way that many governments wanted to, again, promote themselves, so that there could then be kind of cultural tourism via biennials. And Manifesto, I think, was one of the most interesting ones. It's when Russia starts to really kind of get involved in the kind of biennial scene for real, if you like, because Victor Misiano was one of the advisors from 1996 at the very beginning, or a couple of years before that. And so he could start to influence the ways that artists could actually be included, and he's still involved to this day. And this year, we have it at the Hermitage. So let's see what happens there. Thinking about another important aspect of the 1990s to sweep through the decade, it's the expansion of the ways that exhibitions could actually work. And there was a new kind of flexibility that was brought into exhibition making, again influenced by artists, but also by this ability to be able to travel much easier and much faster to many, many more places. So Hans-Ulrich Obrist is one of the people who took this opportunity on at a very early stage. And Do It is an exhibition that is, well, it's now the longest running exhibition ever, because it's still going. And it was started in 1993. And it basically came out of a conversation that Hans-Ulrich had with two artists, Christian Bortansky and Christian Lavier. And it was in Café Select. It's one of those like stories of a good drink at the bar. And they basically asked the question, what would happen if you could make an exhibition that could keep generating itself so it never needed to stop? Because the artists were fed up with being invited to like put a work in one place and put a work in another place and send a work here and send a work there. So how could you make an exhibition that could just keep going by itself? So they devised this way of basically inviting artists to give instructions to make work. And then those instructions would be put together. They were translated into 9 different languages, and they were dispatched to different countries, just as instructions in a book. And then those, the people who received them were able to invite other artists or local communities to make those works and make an exhibition of the instructions, basically in a way that they wanted to interpret them and to make the exhibition themselves. This just gives you an example of a couple of the pages, the types of instructions. Some of them are impossible to do, some of them are absolutely intended to do, some of them are funny, some of them are ridiculous. So it's very, very varied. And it's gone basically from 17 artists first participating to now over 400. I'll just show you a few ways that you can see the differences and how people actually work on producing the pieces. Some of the balls are not so successful. Some are more creative. This is a Felix Gonzalez Torres piece that quite clearly describes that you're supposed to kind of keep the sweets together, but in Italy they seem to misread it. And this is last year actually in Manchester. This is Hans-Ulrich Obrist with Tina Segal. So it keeps kind of reinventing itself. It's one of these exhibitions that generates new versions of itself constantly. So Hans-Ulrich decided to invite there's a number of artists who have now passed away who have given an instruction to do it. So he then invited other artists who are basically fans of the artists who are dead to reinterpret the instructions. So there's lots of different ways that it can keep kind of turning in on itself. There's a Do It Outside version now. There's a Do It Party version. There's an archive of Do It. There's a compendium. And actually, this is the next exhibition that we'll be doing at Garage. So this is what takes place after the personal choice exhibition. So watch out, because you may be asked to do an instruction. In fact, you're doing one, no. One other way of thinking about exhibition making now that's very important is this notion of exhibition histories and kind of starting to look into what do we do to start to record all these things that happen through exhibitions and through institutions. Because we have this thing called the history of art, but it looks at individual works and the stories behind individual works and movements. how do you talk about the history of exhibitions? How do you actually understand what it is to put one work in relation to another, in relation to an audience? And how do we tell that story once it's gone? Because in a way, an exhibition is a kind of performance that it has a duration and then disappears. So there's been this kind of competition, if you like, a big race for I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years, where people are trying to come up with the most original way to look at exhibition histories. And I have to say that I think Prada won last year. I don't know how many of you managed to go to the Venice Biennial. But during the Venice Biennial, the Prada Foundation produced When Attitudes Become Form, the kind of remake. And it was Germano Chalant, Rem Koolhaas and Thomas Demand that collaborated together to rethink or kind of re-look at When Attitudes Become Form. And they did it in this palace, and they literally took the whole of the floor plan of the Kunsthalle Bern, where it first happened, and superimposed it over the palace, and then borrowed as many of the original works as possible, and tried to put them in exactly the places that they would have been in that floor plan, which is crushed into the palace. So you have this kind of mashup, if you like, where the now of the moment that you're walking through, with the deep past of the palace that you're walking through, with the floor plan of the exhibition and some of the original works. However, some of the works did not exist anymore, and so they did this kind of dead body thing, where they put kind of dots on the floor to basically kind of show where it would be, and then a photograph of the work beside it. The image, I'm kind of showing you the historic image and some of the contemporary images. So the bottom and the right one are the contemporary images that I took whilst I was there. This is another example. This is the big image is the historical work. And then I'm kind of showing you what happened underneath. And it's fascinating because, so they reproduced the floor exactly as this kind of big photograph. So this was Thomas Demann's. He kind of looked very much into the details. Things like the kind of splatter that you can see. Is this a pointer? There's a kind of, the splatter piece at the bottom of that corner, the Richard Serra piece. They didn't reproduce that because it was they didn't want to basically like make the gesture that an artist had made to make a work. Some of the works were too fragile, and so they didn't exist anymore, or they couldn't travel. But some of the works could. So you had this kind of weird absence and presence at the same time as you were walking through the show. And of course, one thing that couldn't happen is that the artists weren't there to make the works, because you had to loan them, or you weren't going to remake them. So it completely changed the original premise of the idea that artists come together to make the exhibition. And so you're looking at the idea of an exhibition with objects having an aura or not. Is that what the most important thing is? When we look at an exhibition, is it the end result that is important? Is it the object itself? Is it the process that is making the exhibition that's important? Is it the artists and their acts? Like, what is it? And this exhibition basically gave you a complete headache if you wanted to think about any of those things, because it put them all together in one and kind of left it up to your own devices to work out if you could come out alive. I saw Lawrence Weiner walking through the streets of Venice, and he was deeply stressed by seeing his work that had been made on a staircase, because it was on a staircase in the original one, but they actually had to build the staircase and restructure some of the way that you went around the palace to be able to get that work in the right place in the exhibition, and he just couldn't get his head around it. So just to kind of look back at that triangle, or the pyramid that I was talking about in the first instance, the words that I would like to add to kind of go to the next stage are the word generative, because I think if we think about contemporary curating, we need to understand the fact that anything that we do has to generate something else. It's like curating is no longer kind of the presiding over things. It's about making sure that something actually kind of is set in motion, if you like, and it's as much the audience and as much the kind of the act of exhibition making that is going to change it as anything else. And it's also extremely important to think about geography and duration, time. Because as you can see from all the examples, it's like without these two, you've got something that's very, very flat, and you can start to play with these kind of contexts and with the speeds at which you're making an exhibition to kind of think again about curating. Are you bored yet? Everybody's very quiet. So I want to go back to institutions because we started with institutions, and I want to think about the fact that we're in a new kind of situation now, and particularly here. So in the 1990s, the biggest kind of like internationalizing of institutions was the Guggenheim, of course, and the Guggenheiming of museums. So in Bilbao in 1996, they made the first one. There was a huge hurrah and lots of tourism and millions of dollars spent with this great big thing that is silver and kind of slips all over the landscape. And the collection is shared from the center and sent to different places, and New York tells the regions what to do. It's starting to shift, but that's the basic kind of premise that it was starting with. So you've got that on the one side, the kind of spectacularization of the institution, if you like. And then on the other side, you've got the kind of radicals, the independents, the alternative biennials. And so we're now in the 2000s, in particular, it was the case of like, how do we bring this back together and actually, start to think about making institutions that make sense of all this stuff that we've just gone through in the last few years, in thinking about what curating is, thinking about how artists make work, thinking about what's needed for our institutions. So there was this, in the beginning of 2000s, there was this movement called New Institutionalism, which lasted a whole 4 years. So don't bother to write it down, but it was important insofar as basically what it constituted was a number of curators, like Maria Lind, for example, who had been a curator in an institution, left, been invited to do a whole load of biennials all over the world, Hu Hanru, Hans-Erik Obrist, all these people had been spinning around the world really, really fast, doing lots of shows, and then they grew up and they wanted to work in institutions and they wanted to travel less, or they wanted families, or they wanted some stability. So they didn't want to go back in as curators because they wanted to kind of take their knowledge and turn it into a whole institution, bringing the kind of curatorial terms into institution making. So this was new institutionalism, and it's a term that's actually taken from the social sciences. And it's one that basically means to kind of look at how an institution affects human behavior and to use that as the starting point for how you put that institution together. What it meant in practical terms is that it was a kind of flattening out of everything. So exhibitions were no longer the most important thing. They weren't the center, nor the collections. Education was equally important, research was equally important, audiences could participate in decision making, openings weren't the be all and end all. People could do events throughout the whole duration of the exhibition. Sometimes there were closings. So it was about kind of flattening out the hierarchy, as I say, of the way that an institution works, and thinking very much more about how it kind of impacts the ways that we feel, think, and kind of grow. These examples are all, it started first in the kind of smaller scale institutions, the Kunsthalles, particularly in Germany and across Europe, where there was lots of European funding that could go into this. And then the funding got fed up with the fact that it was all a bit messy, and so often pulled out. The two examples at the bottom are the Van Arber Museum and the Museum in Ljubljana, which is the Museum of Contemporary Art in Ljubljana. And these two are kind of full-blown institutions with collections. The Van Arber is in Eindhoven. And they are still kind of operating under this notion of kind of flattening out the structure. Lots of stories to tell you about what they're doing, but for another time. And then the most recent example is where we come in, where we're sitting now comes in. Because it's the second half of the 2000s, when there's suddenly this, what I kind of call privately funded, publicly minded institutions that start to develop. And they are developing in places that have very little independent infrastructure. So here, for example, there are a number of state institutions, but it was at the beginning of the 2000s and mostly the mid-2000s that there were a number of institutions that developed here in private hands. The Ekaterina Foundation, the Stella Foundation, and Garage in 2008 was one of them, that then kind of grew to starting to think about what a full-blown institution would be. Some of the other examples that I've got up here are the Ulan Center for Contemporary Art in Beijing, which also started in 2008. The one at the top left is In Your Team in Belo Horizonte in Brazil, which is incredible. Go there if you can. It's in the middle of a jungle. And then at the bottom on the left is the Raw Material Company in Dakar in Senegal. And on the bottom right, it's a place called San Art in Vietnam. The bottom two are much, much smaller scale. And they are funded by multiple sources, as you can imagine, because they're in places where there is literally no infrastructure to be able to support this kind of endeavor. But they've been going for a number of years now. What's interesting about all these institutions, if we go back to biennials, is that there came a time in the mid-2000s when I think it was just really important to create stability in places that had a kind of an opportunity to be a place for independent thinking. And the reason why is because when you think about biennials, say let's take the Moscow Biennial. If you think about that, it was a platform from 2006 that enabled the world to think about Moscow for 5 months, no, not 5 weeks. So it basically puts a place and artists on the international platform temporarily, and that kind of moves around the world. What happens with these types of institutions is that it enables international practices and local, regional practices to come together long term and to engage in dialogue about what that actually means locally over time. So it's absolutely the opposite, really, of the biennial. It's the way in which an institution can kind of give a local constituency that ongoing platform, rather than it being a platform actually for international people to come in and out and kind of sightsee, if you like, do the kind of cultural tourism. I'm going to skip me and get to garage. This is the last part. So, because I think that, I mean, what's interesting about my practice, because Nastia asked me to talk about me, which I'm not very fond of, but I started off working in a museum in 1992, and it was a local museum run by council. It was called the Town of Art Gallery in Eastbourne. So I started off in the very first kind of mode of thinking through curating. I then ran my own business called Smith & Fowle, because by 1996, the lottery had come into action, if you like, in the UK, which is where I was born. So Smith & Fowle was an independent curatorial practice that operated out of an office in the East End of London, and we would be commissioned to make exhibitions and commission artists in different places around the country. And it was possible because all this lottery money was replacing the government money and was only supporting temporary improvements to institutions. So at a young age, I could actually kind of have an independent, operation. So it's kind of following the Zeman early days. I then moved to the United States and moved to San Francisco because I fell in love. And luckily I was offered a job. And I was offered the opportunity to set up the first master's program in curatorial practice on the west coast of the United States. So that basically meant that I spent 6 years thinking about what curating meant and what was actually happening. This is in 2001, so thinking about what was actually happening in curating and how to think about it globally and how to teach it. And from there I moved to China, and I worked at the Ulan Center because I was particularly focusing on Asia and what was going on there. And then New York, and now here. So garage, what we are doing right now. Do you like this diagram? It's my most decorative to date. We're thinking about how to pull all the programming together, all the kind of operations of Garage as an institution together. And you know, we talk about Garage as a platform for new thinking. And basically, on this platform, there are a number of different types of programming. And exhibitions has been the one that you've known for the longest. You're sitting in the New Education Center. Education has been developing since 2010. And slowly we're bringing on more research, more ways that we can try and involve artists much more slowly in developing ideas and like looking into local and national and international histories that emerge out of here, and kind of digging deeper into what we've got as material here. And basically the way that I think about it is that we're shifting Garage from being a receiving house where we receive one exhibition after another from different places or one event after another. And we're thinking more like a production house now. So we're producing things from the inside. We're looking to try and collaborate with our audiences much more, with local communities, with international communities, and trying to kind of make it more of a kind of ongoing process. So each exhibition builds on the next, and you can go backwards and forwards through our exhibitions program, education program, research program, archive, and see kind of connections that you can get involved in at different levels, or you can research through yourself at different levels if you want to. This show opened a couple of days ago. Check it out. It's one of the kind of examples. We've invited 22 collectors from Moscow or originally from Moscow, to lend one work from their private collection because we wanted to find out what they've got. It's very interesting that you don't know what many people around you actually have in their collections. So generously, they have all lent one work that they want to kind of make public and think about in terms of a public perception. And then we have interviewed them and basically kind of found out what their motivations for collecting. And this is extremely important because to think about the ecology of any kind of art community, there are many integral parts, and collectors are one of them. And the ways in which collectors can actually start to support artists and support institutions is also extremely important. I mean, patronage for artists, for institutions has been kind of the backbone for a very long time for many institutions. I don't know if any of you managed to come, but we made a conference, the first conference in the gallery space. So rethinking what the gallery space is actually for. Can it just be for having discussions, for talking? Can you kind of stage debate as something that people can come and go from over time? Interesting outcome. Reconstruction 2 is on at the moment. We've started to think through how we can animate the archive that we've been building since 2012. And this archive, for those of you that don't know, is based on the history of Russian contemporary art. So it really focuses from the 1990s forwards, supported by material from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s by artists, and avant-garde. And so basically we've been producing books. The second book is just coming out, and collaborating with the Ekaterina Foundation and Elena Selena for making exhibitions and kind of rethinking or relooking at what the 90s actually meant, because it's a period of time here that is just starting to be thought about. For those of you that are getting itchy, I've got like one more slide, and then I promise I'll shut up. And then, so Garage Research is another kind of new program. This is the newest one. We started it last year. And it's called Field Research. And it's basically finding a way to invite practitioners who have some kind of special interest in what's going on here and support them in that research. Trying to find different ways of actually understanding what constitutes this city and this country. So for example, there's a woman called Koyo Kuo, who is the founding director of the raw material company that you saw in one of the last slides in Dakar. And she is spending the next 2 years coming back and forth to Moscow to do research into 4 of the most important African filmmakers, all of whom were educated in Moscow, and all of whom cite Moscow and their education here and their experience of being here as central to the way that they have thought about how their career and how filmmaking develops. So she's doing research into this whole phenomena. She's meeting with the filmmakers. She's going into archives here. She's meeting with different practitioners. And we'll be looking over time to see how that turns into either an exhibition or a book or a screening program, or maybe all of them. So giving people time to kind of find out what's going on here and try and kind of look at what's around us in a different way. So I will stop there. That's the latest of what I've been trying to do here with the whole team, and I will answer questions if there are any after that overload of information. Thank you very much.
So, and did this, it's my personal question. So when you say you were, thanks to Art Council, well, you had a chance to be trained as curator, did it involve any traveling? So was it like a cross-Britain project, or how, for example, it's happening?
I mean, it's similar to what we're trying to set up here. So it was basically the opportunity to work as a curator in an institution and be trained by the director. And then I was sent off on 4 different training programs for 1 week at a time, and they would do things like personnel management for 1 week. They would lock you in a hotel, and you had to learn how to manage people. Or you had to do like marketing and PR, and then they put you in front of a television and they made you like present something and then showed you how terrible you looked whilst you were doing it. And so you trained not to do what I'm doing now and had to sit on your hands so you didn't wave them around and things like that.
I see. So the question is whether it's important whether it's definitive to have an art historian education, or if there is any education which is definitive for profession of curator, or it's just inside wish, inside feeling and intuition, and you're really idea that you are a curator and that you want it. What do you think is more important?
A number of options. There are now specific curating programs, masters in curating, that you can go to. There are short course training programs. Some people say you can't learn to be a curator because it is about instinct and it's about building relationships and communication. I think that it's possible to teach people the kind of thing that I've been talking about today, so that you can see different models and examples, and I think that it's interesting to learn that so you don't reinvent the wheel every time you try and make an exhibition. But personally I would say that you don't have to have an art history background, you don't have to have an art background, but you do need to have a lot of patience, and you need to be prepared to work extremely long hours. That's what I'd say is the 2 most important things.
The role of curator, maybe specifically you as a curator, because you are a curator, particularly here in the institution, this site, this place, particular location. So is curator more a director, like a film director, or like a cook, chef, that simply chooses what ingredients to put into the bowl in order to make the soup? Or it's, curator like a director, film director, like a godfather, like godmother, that rules the artists, painters, and manages them somehow.
We could argue all night about the final definition, but for me personally, the role of the curator is this triangle that I was talking about, the pyramid, because it's about working between things and bridging relationships. It's about communicating, like finding ways to communicate between audiences. You need to understand space, you need to understand how to activate it, because there's a way you can feel when you walk into an exhibition and you can feel the space, you can feel the dynamics between works. It makes such a difference. You need to spend time visiting artists, doing studio visits, reading about them over and over and over again, because just what you knew to make one exhibition 2 years ago, the artist makes new work and you can't just forget them because you showed one work and that's it. So it's this kind of ongoing, for me it's an ongoing process of kind of connecting between audiences, artists and space.
I have a question. You, being a curator, are there any projects or maybe exhibitions where you wouldn't like to work with, you wouldn't get into it? Are there anything that distracts you? Maybe that you wouldn't try to exhibit or participate or somehow deal with them? Thank you.
My pet peeve at the moment?
What, maybe it's not interesting for you, or maybe some other reasons for refusal from your side.
The big thing that my pet peeve at the moment is people who keep sending us material because they want to show their country here. Or they wonder if we'd like to, we the little people would like to see what it's like in America, or what it's like in, these types of exhibitions that are very much about kind of dispatching culture to different places. And I really don't like that kind of exhibition where it's very didactic and it's sending you a message. It's not really anything to do with the artists or the ways that the artists are thinking. It's this kind of, so that's the kinds of exhibitions I really don't like.
Kate, thank you very much for very interesting ideas. My question is about your position. Is it possible to establish, build up a successful career as a curator, independent curator, without belonging to a particular gallery, particular space? Or sooner or later, the career will always finish up with certain institution which you are to be coped with?
It comes down to money, doesn't it? So there's two things. One, actually I don't really believe in the word independent, because I think as a curator it's impossible to be independent, because you're dependent on artists, you're dependent on having a space to do something in. So I think of it more like interdependent, because you're kind of, if you're working by yourself and not for an institution, you're dependent on between lots of things. I think it's possible to do it. I think that many people who do it are closer to artists, because you're basically struggling to you can't really make a living on making one show and then making the next show. You need to do some writing, you need to do some teaching, so it's more the way that an artist actually tries to so it's kind of closer to that. And it's not impossible, it's just a very different process. I actually quite enjoy it, but it's one of those things where I also love institutions. And I love kind of working, like the idea of putting everything together and kind of thinking of the whole institution rather than just one exhibition is something that excites me.
Can you tell me, did you ever want to give up with curatorship? And if yes, what it was related with, and how do you overcome crisis in your profession? Thank you.
Never wanted to give it up. No, it annoys me a lot sometimes, but it's patience. That's what I was saying before. It's like it's one of those things where it's extremely rewarding to be able to look back over 25 years and kind of see what's happened, 23 years, and see the ways that some of my thinking now is actually really grown out of some of the first shows that I was doing. And so again, it goes back to the fact that I trained as an artist, I think does relate to the way that I think of myself as a curator. It's not really a kind of choice. It's not like a job that I put on in the morning and then like let go of at night. I kind of live it. And so therefore, even if I get really frustrated and annoyed, I've got to find a way to deal with it rather than walk away from it. Because if I try and walk away from it, I tried to walk away from it when I fell in love. I thought I'd just be like a hippie in California, and it didn't work. So.
Good evening. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. I have a question. Do you think that art market is saturated with curators professionals? Is there any demand for people of this profession? Or there are so many of us today, or let's say oversaturation, there are too many people who try to get there and cannot find jobs, find positions due to objective reasons? Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's a good question, because especially with all these curating programs and, with the rise of the curator being so cool, it's, where are all the jobs? I think that the galleries, museums will keep expanding, things will keep appearing, disappearing, some will grow, some will develop, and I think that there will always be a demand. But I do think that that's why the rise of the independent curator and how to actually support it has been important. And actually the other side of my job, my life, is an organisation called Independent Curators International, which is an organisation specifically to support curators, wherever they are in the world, and to create a way in which you can kind of share dialogue and develop exhibitions that can go to different places and, basically kind of support that kind of independent thinking. it's another reason why we opened up the project space this month here as well, because the idea with that is that it will give people who are not working at Garage an opportunity to curate exhibitions and try and kind of open things up. We're also starting like training programs to try and talk about what it is that people want to know and learn about curating, and then how to, we're hoping that then we can start to try and help support the infrastructure so that there can be some alternative practices happening in different places. But it's not an easy, there's not an easy answer. And when your question about the commercial market, I'm not one of these people that thinks that commercial bad, like non-commercial good, because we cannot do without it. It's like a healthy art world in a place needs a bit of everything, because everything has a cause and effect. If you knock, and you know, you've seen that in Moscow when the commercial market dies, and then artists aren't getting as much support, and then there's less opportunities, and you know, it's this kind of. So, but I would say that there aren't many curators in commercial galleries. I think that, I mean, there's a number of curators that have gone into commercial galleries because they can get paid lots of money, but they're not necessarily given the opportunity to curate. They're just good at looking after artists. So they do the looking after the artist bits, and then other people sell the work.
Good evening. I want to ask a question about the possible ways. What are possible ways to come to curatorship, to become a curator, if there is such internal wish, desire, enthusiasm to do it? There are ideas, but how to come to that? What are possible ways, mechanisms, I don't know, institutions, or maybe, I don't know, or it happens through direct meeting with some people, I don't know.
Yeah, come and bug us. No, first, in very practical terms, without doing anything at all, like when I was admitting people for the master's program in curating, what I would look for was not necessarily like years and years of experience in a museum or gallery. I was looking for somebody who loved art and who had an interest in artists. And the way to demonstrate that was going to see as many exhibitions as possible and working out what you think about that exhibition. So rather than just kind of walking in and being a passive viewer, kind of thinking about the relationship that you're being given, the stories that you're being told by the exhibition and the person that made it. Because like a good exhibition will have a kind of texture to it that you'll be able to read in different ways. And so kind of forming opinions around that and what you actually think about the way that an exhibition is put together, how you would do it differently, how you would be able to kind of present things differently, really helps to start thinking curatorially. Also meeting with artists and talking about their work and finding out what they do and not being scared to do that, because sometimes it's a bit daunting, but you know, it's one of those things where just talking to artists and actually building relationships with them goes a long way. And then the practical experience is, I mean, I volunteered in about 7 different institutions before I actually got a job. I got fed up with it because I didn't get any money, and I don't come from a rich family. But it's the way to get experience, so I could kind of see how different types of institutions worked.
Good evening. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question that I love to ask everybody whose opinion is important to me. Could you give me a recommendation, one or several books that you read, you think they're important, they're worth reading to be read by everybody? It could be books about curatorship, maybe some, any sort of literature. Your recommendations. Thank you.
Well, the book that I'm reading right now is on Russian fairy tales. And then I've got a pile of books beside my bed that are like the ones that don't get read at night, because the fairy tales are much more interesting. I'll have to, like, I can give you some later, but right now, I've got about 25,000 in my head all at once, but they're pretty boring unless you're a nerd, because they're things like the intellectual planning of the Museum of Modern Art, or NSK in Moscow. So.
Good evening.
Существуют какие-то этические
Are there any
инструкции,
ethical
этические
codes,
нормы?
ethical norms for the curators? What is allowed, what is not allowed, what is possible, what is not possible?
This is the kind of question we were asking in the conference around ethics and performance. And I would say that it's not to do with what is allowed and what isn't allowed. I would say that ethics for me is about the way that you personally conduct yourself through everything, not just through curating. And so I think that you set yourself standards and you set yourself kind of parameters through which you're willing to work, and then you check in with yourself as often as possible and make sure that you're not contradicting what your belief system is with those ethics. So, I mean, honestly, it would take a longer conversation to say specifically what the ethics are, but one of the biggest conversations that I have had around this topic is to do with where you get funding from. For example, when Attitudes Become Form, the biggest sponsor, the only reason why it was possible is because Philip Morris, the cigarette company, completely or pretty much 100% funded the exhibition. And there was a lot of TV coverage and an awful lot of marketing and you'll see all the artists are smoking in the exhibition hall when they're making the work, and it's like, and there's a lot of questions. It's like, do you accept that kind of money? Are you willing, where are your limitations? What are you prepared to accept in order to get what it is that you want?
And so do you think, for example, for you personally, if there is any fixation on that, or it depends like any fixed rule for this? Like where you get funding and where you're not, or you think in every case it depends on the person you work with? And
I mean, I would not want to take money from sources that I know are like directly involved in killing people.
Yeah, I have the same.
Or moving arms that can kill people. But what's interesting is that these values, it's like, again, it falls back into the kind of private or the collectors or the this, that, and the other. It's like, basically the whole art world is based on money that is going to be dirty in some way or other, somewhere along the line. The question is how dirty? And then the question is like, does it matter because dirty is dirty? But then if you're not going to take any dirty money, then you're not going to breathe, basically.
Yeah, I understand.
Continuing this question, we're always talking being independent curator, but as we know, this whole infrastructure of exhibition manufacturing, production of art events, all that requires huge financial inputs. And in this case, state financing, especially in such countries like our country, here, this country, it would be, I would say, difficult, simply saying. Then there could be some money from the sponsors, as you just mentioned, dirty money. Then independent NGOs, they also have their own policies. So how to survive in such neoliberal conditions and how to stay independent for the curator? Thank you.
I think this is why in recent years you've seen the development of these kind of bureaus or these kinds of offices for contemporary art. It's similar to Smith and Fowle, the business that I ran in London, which was basically myself and a business partner called Deborah Smith, who was another curator. And we had an office about the size of this table, 3 of these tables, and we had one computer that we shared and a fax machine, and that was it to begin with. And basically we integrated talks. We used to use a cafe and get talks going with artists. We integrated different ways of writing, and there are a number of well-known organizations like that now all over the world, and not necessarily in places that are developed in any way. So, for example, there's an organization called Beirut in Cairo, which is like 2 young people who are developing it. There's a number in Ljubljana. There's transit that works between Prague, Bratislava. It basically works between 5 different countries. It's in Budapest, in Romania. And they're all kind of small-scale organizations that don't necessarily think about curating just as exhibition making. They think about it as producing different ways of creating discourse, of engagement with art, and exhibitions can be as small as one work, exhibitions can be kind of movable, exhibitions can be one day. The onset of the internet, I think for like younger generations, basically from my age onwards, has been extremely useful because you can actually look quite productive and you can keep a dialogue going with people over time, and it's not that you actually have to be doing an exhibition in a space this big and spending $100,000 or millions of rubles to produce it. I think there's ways, if you want to engage in the kind of curatorial discourse that is out there, there are many, many, many smaller organizations, and if you want to know some, then I'm happy to tell you later.
To me, it's really very important because I'm involved in the educational programs, plus to the fact that you mentioned about the exhibitions that are brought to Russia from different, embassies, whatever. Sometimes they're organized national ways, let's say, the best films from one country, the best art from the other country, Sometimes it's positioned as educational because we haven't seen it in Russia, now we brought it here in, and this is how we educate you. So to me, a very important question is, where is the borderline between such excessive didactics and education? And maybe this borderline, so where is it actually? What do you think about it? Thank you. Or what helps to transform this initial aggressive didactics into real educational project? Thank you.
I think the answer is to think about what it is that you want in terms of how you want to learn. Because the beauty of education, learning, pedagogical programs in informal institutions like an art museum, rather than through the school or the university system, is that it is not your job or it's not our job to provide the foundational education, although sometimes actually museums have had to because it's been lacking in schools. But so in that way, it's about trying to think about this kind of interconnectedness in the same way that you think about interconnectedness between artworks in an exhibition. And the problem that I have with this kind of didactic, like look at what's coming from this country and look at what's coming from that country, is that, there is no connection, and it's there's a kind of inherent nationalism that is already so virile in any instinct anyway, that it doesn't allow for any nuances of how to actually even understand the one monolith that you've been given to look at, let alone kind of understand it in relation to anything else.
So I think the reply to that, like in positive way, how to do that is research, right? So, or like Gary's research field, which we have, so it just implies connecting
or spending whatever money, because all these places want money for their stuff. Mm-hmm. And even if it's only $10, spending that money on doing a Skype with 3 people that you found on the internet mm-hmm. from different places and having a conversation, recording it and putting it somewhere else, rather than this kind of packaged mm-hmm. Way of actually understanding what other people are doing in other places. Yeah. I'm suspicious of it all the time.
Yeah, I think it's just important that all the audiences also like get into this idea that researches or any projects which are based on research and open up the research, they are like very important to have a positive way of kind of fight with this didactic. So it's not you're telling that it's just not happening, but you just provide any kind of responses and reactions which are structured.
Then probably we should say thank you very much to Kate.